Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely chilling thought experiment from Professor Jiang Xueqin. We're going to unpack exactly how a few seemingly isolated geopolitical dominoes could end up triggering a massive national crisis in the US by the year 2027. Now here's the thing. A healthy nation can usually hear dark predictions and just kind of shrug them off, right? But a fragile one? Well, they tremble. So let's take a closer look at the actual anatomy of that tremble. Okay, let's just quickly map out the exact sequence of cascading pressures we'll be looking at today. Number 1, when war comes home. Number 2, the breaking point of youth. 3, security versus political control. 4, the hidden economic battlefield. And finally, number 5, the collapse of national trust. To really understand why this warning feels so possible right now, we can't just look at these things as isolated headlines. It's actually a chain reaction. Think of it like this. War breeds pressure, right? And then pressure breeds fear. That fear forces domestic enforcement, which then triggers resistance, which leads to economic panic and ultimately straight-up conflict. Honestly, it's the stark difference between a nation that can take a punch and one with a glass jaw just waiting to shatter. All right, Section 1, when war comes home and the trap of an unclear foreign war. So I want to pose this crucial question to you directly. When does military action actually become a trap? Dwight Eisenhower, who absolutely knew the brutal reality of combat firsthand, warned us about starting conflicts without a totally clear exit strategy. If we use a theoretical war with Iran as our focal point here, the source material reminds us of a really harsh truth. A ground invasion isn't some slick Hollywood movie. It is a grueling road with absolutely no easy off-ramp. Professor Jiang Xueqin really hits the nail on the head here. To quote him, "A trap begins when the government can explain how a war starts better than how it ends." I mean, if a nation is already tearing itself apart domestically, entering a murky foreign conflict is literally like throwing a match into a powder keg. Any initial confidence you might have had just instantly morphs into mass confusion. We also have to remember James Madison's timeless warning. A republic should absolutely fear a war without clear boundaries, simply because confusion during wartime is incredibly dangerous to liberty. Let's be real. Foreign danger is the ultimate excuse for domestic power grabs. When leaders can't quite explain the path to victory, they almost always turn around and ask citizens to surrender their freedoms in the name of, patience. Moving right along to Section 2, the breaking point of youth, focusing on the draft and national trust. Let's run a bit of a stress test here. Could a draft actually work in a country that's already deeply divided? I mean, picture young people who already feel totally locked out of the American dream. They're crushed by rent, drowning in student debt, and just deeply cynical about institutions in general. To an older generation, getting a draft letter means duty. But to a disillusioned youth, it sounds a whole lot like a demand for their bodies to fight a war they don't even believe in. I think this Gen Z quote really gets to the absolute core of it. If leaders want duty from us, we need honesty from them. Shifting to this perspective, we see that young people aren't necessarily terrified of sacrifice for its own sake. What they're terrified of is being used by leaders who have zero credibility left. You just can't ask a whole generation to give up their lives and try to pay them in empty political slogans. The text here underscores something critical. If a draft is forced onto a fractured society, mass refusal wouldn't just be your ordinary protest on a Saturday afternoon. It would be a fatal crisis of legitimacy for the entire system. Sure, forced service might pump out a few soldiers in the short term, absolutely. But it also breeds a really deep, venomous resentment that follows those citizens right back to their hometowns. This brings us to Section 3, security versus political control, and what happens when protection starts to feel a lot like occupation. As domestic unrest boils over, governments usually respond by doing what they do best, deploying troops, like the National Guard, onto their own streets. But we have to look at George Orwell's incredibly chilling reality check here. The exact same uniform tells two entirely different stories depending on who's looking at it. To one citizen, it screams, "You are safe." But to another, it says, "You are being watched." And just look at how the language gets twisted. Suddenly, safety just becomes a demand for silence, and a completely legitimate critic gets branded as an extremist. Which leads us straight into Orwell's ultimate warning. The most dangerous control is the kind people no longer notice. What's really interesting here is how it warns us that emergency powers practically never announce themselves as tyranny. No way. They always show up wearing the really comforting mask of temporary public safety. But once a military presence just becomes the routine, the state stops seeing citizens they need to protect, and they just start seeing problems they need to manage. Okay, let's step away from the philosophical stuff for a second. Section 4, the hidden economic battlefield. Or, as I like to call it, the war at the kitchen table. Because look, most of us don't experience a national crisis by reading 50-page geopolitical white papers, right? We experience it right there in the checkout aisle. We're talking surging milk and grocery costs, rent that is just entirely out of reach, paychecks shrinking to nothing, retirement accounts plummeting. Historically speaking, literally nothing breaks public support for a war faster than empty shelves and worthless paychecks. We all saw how fast global supply chains buckled under pressure back in 2020. This is the hidden battlefield where grand, sweeping strategy violently crashes into daily survival. This is an incredibly poignant takeaway. A country cannot keep asking its people for sacrifice if those people already feel sacrificed. When the middle class feels completely and utterly abandoned by the system, patience just evaporates. I mean, if leaders are on TV preaching about this grand national purpose, but a family can't even afford a gallon of milk, that war becomes deeply, deeply personal, and that kind of anger is terrifyingly easy to organize. And as all these pressures compound, we hit the climax of the explainer, Section 5, the collapse of national trust, and what civil war actually looks like in the modern age. We really need to redefine our expectations here. A modern societal collapse, it is not going to be two armies lining up in a field wearing blue and gray. It's everywhere and nowhere at once. It's that exact, quiet moment when citizens just lay down their trust and decide, you know what, peaceful correction just isn't possible anymore. It is completely defined by weaponized language, the absolute death of a shared reality, and looking out your window and seeing your neighbor as an existential threat. And you can see how this descent doesn't just happen overnight. It is a terrifyingly logical progression. First, just basic natural political disagreements curdle into deep moral condemnation. Then, trust totally vanishes because people feel like neutral institutions have been captured by the other side. Because everyone is suddenly acting like it's a permanent emergency, the ordinary rule of law starts looking really weak. And before you know it, the completely abnormal is just normal. Eisenhower had this incredibly stoic perspective on this. He said, "A nation can survive anger. It cannot survive forever on suspicion. A republic is basically engineered from the ground up to handle heated arguments and factions. We can deal with that. What it cannot survive is permanent mutual contempt. When every single election gets framed as a literal matter of national life or death, the losing side is never going to accept defeat peacefully." So how do we pull back from this? Well, the ultimate resolution of this thought experiment is that military or police strength cannot glue a fractured country back together. Slick PR won't do it either. Trust has to be built by absolute truth, protected by genuine government restraint, and restored through real accountability. And here is the major catch. This repair work has to happen before the crisis hits. Once those dominoes are already falling, it is way too late to try and invent trust. I want to leave you with one final, incredibly provocative stress test to chew on. If all of these pressures, a murky foreign war, a rejected draft, massive economic panic, and armed troops in the streets, if all of that arrived on our doorstep tomorrow, what would actually hold the country together? It's a heavy question, for sure, but honestly, grappling with it right now is the only way to ensure this thought experiment doesn't end up becoming our reality. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.